Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. In this one we have several developments, although there are a lot of territorial changes. In the direction of Avdiivka, the Russians continue their active offensive operations in the direction of Lozuvatka, Yevhenivka and Novoslivka Persha. In the direction of Novoslivka Persha, the Russians launched a flanking maneuver from the Novopokrovsk direction to flank to the south of the Ukrainian fortified position and is now attacking it both from the north and from the east at the same time. It is reported by Deep State Map that the Russians are currently launching offensive operations to gain a foothold in Novoselivka Persha from the north and east. This includes from the roads here to the main eastern positions, the fortified direction, and to the northwest. So this is a large offensive operation towards Novoselivka Persha from the three different directions. If the Russians succeed with this operation, they'll be able to capture Novoselivka Persha, and it will allow the Russians to align the front line to the Vovchansk river line, where the next offensive operations will take place along the river line, where the Ukrainians have several fortified positions, similar to when the Russians were fighting over Berdishi, Semenivka, and Umansk. So this could put a stop to the current Russian momentum, as these are well-fortified positions of the Ukrainians. To the north, in the direction of Yevhenivka, the Russians have closed in on the village from the north as they flanked the Ukrainian positions in the area and are fighting over the final parts of it. According to the Deep Map, the Russians are currently storming Yevhenivka and continuing assaults throughout the village. So we see heavy fighting in the entirety of the Yevhenivka and Novoslivka Persha direction, where the Russians are simply launching assaults all across to capture the frontline towns and villages. At the same time, in the direction of Lozuvatka, the Russians have reached the outskirts of the village, which is yet again another one of the non-village villages. There's pretty much nothing but forest lines, and it just has a name. So we see fighting continuing here towards the village of Timofeivka, as well as here in the fortified positions west of Novokalynove. This was reported by Deep State Map and this one by Syriac Maps. So we see continuous fighting here in the direction of Novokalynove as well, also the north of the village. This shows that the Russians are expanding their zone of control by Novokalynove towards the villages of Lozuvatka, Timofeivka, Vostyshenka, and Berenivka, where their objective here is to advance towards the highway between Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka, as well as to cross over this riverline defense area, where the Russian objective here is to develop offensive operations in the direction of the highway. So we see continuous pushes by the Russians and offensive operations here in this section of the front line towards the Ukrainian fortified positions to capture them one by one as they continue pushing along the Oshiritina direction. Gaining control over the Vovchansk river line here to the south will allow the Russians to focus their forces in a stronger push here in the direction of Pokrovsk, as well as the highway, and to develop the offensive operations in the north of Avdiivka towards Konstantinivka. At the same time, here in the direction of New York, we see this footage here, which is a picture of the tunnel which the Russians actually built in the 2 years of the war. They spent a lot of time building this tunnel. This is why there was no active offensive operations in this section of the front line, because the Russians had a plan to completely bypass 3 kilometers long of defensive fortifications and positions, and this allowed them to capture Yurivka and this entirety of the southern parts of New York in just one day due to this tunnel being built and significantly improving their positions. The sudden appearance of Russian soldiers 3 kilometers deep into Ukrainian defensive lines also created a panic for the Ukrainian defensive positions, and this led to the Ukrainians abandoning much of their fortified positions here to the southeast of New York and consolidating them here to the east. This meant that the Russians were able to capture those fortified positions as well. At the same time, we saw a similar case here in the Toretsk direction. Here it's not clear whether it was one they built themselves or one they used connected to the canal. But either way, we see that the Russians made use of tunnels both in the direction of Toretsk and New York to develop their operations and gain a lot of ground, which allowed them to bypass Ukrainian fortified positions and now fight over the next lines of defense, bypassing the first ones. As we see, there's no significant Ukrainian defensive positions south of New York, and to the east of Toretsk there's the second line of defense, and the Russians have captured the entirety of the first one. The developments here in the Toretsk and New York section of the front line is critical because it demands a lot more units to be redirected here to establish and securing the front line after the Russian breakthrough. We see that the Ukrainians are launching counterattacks here to the south of New York to re-establish the defensive positions there, and in the east they are struggling to hold on to Drushba due to the Russian positions further westwards, which prevents the Ukrainian reinforcements from arriving to the village, and the Russians are slowly advancing in that direction. At the same time, the main pressure is taking place by the apartment complex area east of the new second line of Ukrainian defenses in the Toretsk direction. All of this exerts immense pressure on the Ukrainian positions here in the east, both the Avdiivka and Toretsk directions. At the same time, the Russians continue pressuring the Ukrainian positions in the Decisive direction, and in the direction of the Luhansk-Kharkiv section of the border, we see that the Russians are deploying continuously, both with missiles and bombs, and we see at the same time heavy bombardment of the front line. So we see several Russian offensive operations taking place, both in the direction of Konstantinivka, Avdiivka, Volodar, Toretsk, Decisive, and in the Luhansk-Kharkiv border area. In this entire eastern front, there's constantly Russian offensive operations as they continue their pressure in the direction of the Ukrainian forces. In the northern part of the front line in the Kharkiv section, we hear a lot of reports of the fighting taking place, and it changes by the day. We have seen a continuous Ukrainian momentum where they try to recapture Lozuvatka as well as Vovchansk. However, it is recently reported that the Russians started hitting the flanks of the Ukrainians in Vovchansk. This is an objective where they plan on cutting off the supplies of the Ukrainians in the north and pushing them out of the north by attacking them in the flanks, as the Russians are trying to hit where they are the strongest by the aggregate plant and gaining full control of it, and the Ukrainians are pushing through to hold their lines by the citadel area, where their objective similarly is to cut off the supplies of the Russians. So we're seeing hits by the Russians and the Ukrainians on the flanks of each other as they both attempt to improve their positions here in the Vovchansk section of the front line. The Ukrainians now have full control over the eastern parts, which gives them a strong control over their eastern parts as a defensive posture, while the Russians have fortified positions to the north, which makes it difficult for the Ukrainians to push onwards. This means that the main focus of the Ukrainians will now switch to the central parts, where the majority of their forces will be concentrated to push the Russians out of the northern parts of the Vovcha river line and Vovchansk. And at the same time, the Russians will be focusing on gaining control over the southern bank and to cut off the supplies of the Ukrainians here to the south, and at the same time hit their flank by recapturing these positions to the east to cut them off from the northern bank of the Vovcha river line. So we see and hear reports of massive fighting taking place in Vovchansk, and both the Russians and the Ukrainians are both on the offensive at the same time as they try to cut off the supplies and improve their positions and push the other side out of the town. In conclusion, what we see is that the Russians and the Ukrainians continue to pressure the other side. The Ukrainians are trying to recapture the northern parts due to the heavy pressure on the east. It is difficult for them to hold their positions and hold their forces in the north, as it makes it difficult for them to hold their positions and their forces in the east. Their current position is that they simply do not have enough forces for both at the same time and to hold back the Russians, much less prepare for a counter-offensive. At the same time, the Russians continue pressuring the Ukrainians in the north of Kharkiv, in the Sumy region, where there's a danger for the Ukrainians that the Russians may open a new front. So all of this forces the Ukrainians to spread out their forces, and the Russians continue the offensive operations in the east in the meantime. And that is all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.